Welcome back, my friends. I'm Mr. Wolf, and this is Timeless Tales. The Mongols had come, not once, not twice, but thrice. Twice before, they tasted bitter defeat at the hands of Daiviet. Yet the great Khan, Kublai, could not forget. In 1287, he sent his mightiest host yet. Fleets of warships, armies stretching across mountains and rivers, all to break a small kingdom that refused to kneel. This is the story of the third Mongol invasion of Daiviet, the fiercest, the bloodiest, and the last. Twice defeated by Daiviet, Kublai Khan burned with rage. Furious at the humiliation, he abandoned his plans to invade Japan, vowing instead to crush Daiviet once and for all. Once again, he placed Prince Tat Huan in command of the campaign, with the seasoned general Ali Haichi as his deputy, alongside many veterans who had already fought in Viet lands. The Yuan court raised a fresh army of nearly 300,000 men. Almost 300 warships were built in haste, with 70 vessels assigned solely to carry supplies, rice, grain, and fodder for the horses, under the command of Zhang Wenhu. Yet fate interfered. Ali Haichi, the trusted deputy, died suddenly of illness, and rebellions across the Yuan Empire forced Kublai to stretch his forces thin. Still, his determination never wavered. At the dawn of 1286, the Trần court released 50,000 captured Yuan soldiers as a gesture of goodwill. Daiviet showed restraint, diplomacy, and mercy, but nothing could cool the vengeance burning in the heart of Kublai Khan. With war looming, Trần Hưng Đạo stood before his king with confidence, declaring, "The enemy this year will be easier to defeat." He then organized a grand military review to strengthen discipline and raise morale. By this time, Daiviet's army had swelled to an estimated 320,000 men, ready to face the storm that was about to descend. By the end of 1287, Prince Tat Huan returned once more, this time under the pretense of restoring Trần Ik Tak, the so-called King of Annam, to his throne. His armies pressed forward to Chotu Min, right on the border of Daiviet. As before, the Mongols advanced in three mighty columns. The first force, under the command of Ai Lo, marched down through Yunnan along the Tao and Lo rivers. The second, the main host, was led by Tuat Huan himself, with Trần Ich Tak at his side, crossing into the northeastern frontier. And the third was the fleet. 500 warships commanded by Ma Ni, followed closely by the supply convoy under Zhang Wenhu, laden with provisions and fodder for the coming campaign. On December 29th, 1287, the Mongol armies advanced into Lukcho. Tat Huan divided his forces into two columns. Buddha Habar and Zheng Bingfei led 10,000 men westward toward the Chilang Pass, while Abachi marched with another 10,000 through the eastern route toward Vạn Kiếp. Tat Huan himself followed close behind Abachi's column with the main host. This time, the Trần dynasty had learned from past campaigns. They no longer placed heavy defenses on the mountain passes. Instead, small detachments harassed the invaders while the main army waited for the right moment to strike at the Mongols' vulnerable rear. Because of this, both Mongol columns pushed into Daiviet's central plain with little resistance. But when Buddha Habar and Zheng Bingfei reached Bakjiang, they finally met fierce resistance under General Trần Quan. Unable to break through, the Mongols halted and awaited reinforcements from Tat Huan. Within just 4 days, Tat Huan himself pressed forward and arrived at Vạn Kiếp. There, he encountered the grand formations of Daiviet's army, commanded by the legendary Trần Hưng Đạo. The Trần deployed in vast numbers, hoping to force Tat Huan into a pitched battle before he could link with his allies. Yet Tat Huan was wiser now. He no longer considered seizing Thăng the key objective. Instead, he recognized Vạn Kiếp as the true strategic ground, where he intended to unite his forces with Zheng Bingfei on land and Ma Ni on the rivers before delivering a decisive blow. Meanwhile, at sea, Ma Ni left the supply fleet trailing behind and surged forward into the waters off Van Ninh and Mong Khai. At the mouth of Ngoc Son, he was ambushed by Trần Tuan's fleet lying in wait. Outnumbered, the Trần sailors fought valiantly, but could not halt the Mongol advance. Pushing deeper, the Mongols then clashed with a larger fleet under Trần Khánh Du near the waters of Vân Đồn. The battle raged fiercely, but once again, the Mongols seized the upper hand, forcing Trần Khánh Du to order a retreat. Seizing the momentum, Ma Ni pressed swiftly into the Bạch Đằng River, racing to join Tat Huan at Vạn Kiếp exactly as their strategy demanded. In the early days of January 1288, Prince Togan himself led the mighty Yuan army to strike at Van Kip even as the fleet of Omar Ni sailed to join him. But what he met there was no grand defense, for Trần Hưng Đạo had only staged his formations to provoke and delay. The clash at Van Kip was swift, and soon the forces of Daiviet withdrew into the shadows. With little resistance, Togan occupied Van Kip with ease. There, he raised his grand headquarters, sending out waves of soldiers to scour the surrounding lands. Yet, though he claimed the field, the game was far from over. Retreating with careful intent, Trần Hưng Đạo ordered new lines drawn along the Duong River, forming a shield before the capital of Thăng Long. Meanwhile, to the north, another storm brewed. The army under Ai Lo pushed its way through Quy Hoa, pressing into Daiviet. At Bạch Hạc, they clashed with the noble Trần Nhật Duật. Outnumbered and hard-pressed, the Daiviet warriors fell back toward Phu Luông. Brave generals Lê Thạc and Ha Ang fought fiercely, holding the rear to buy time, until, surrounded and overpowered, they were captured and slain. And so, the Yuan tide rolled ever deeper into the heart of Daiviet. On January 21st, 1288, the Yuan forces, army and navy combined, struck at the Trần stronghold along the Duong River. Yet Trần Hưng Đạo, ever the strategist, ordered his men to fight as they fell back, retreating toward the capital. Seizing the momentum, the enemy surged forward, their sights set on Thăng Long. But once again, they found themselves chasing shadows. For upon his return to the capital, Trần Hưng Đạo unleashed the old stratagem of scorched earth, leaving behind nothing for the invaders to seize. In secret, he spirited the Trần king down the Red River, slipping toward the sea, then circling inland to Thác Sun. Yet, fate intervened. Omar Ni's fleet spotted the royal flotilla. Pressed by danger, the king was forced to sail southward into Thanh Hoa, while Trần Hưng Đạo himself led another force north, drawing enemy eyes away. Omar Ni pursued with only a few dozen ships, but upon hearing whispers that Trần troops awaited in Thanh Hoa, he turned back, unwilling to gamble. In his frustration, passing through Thái Bình, he desecrated the sacred ancestral tombs of the Trần dynasty, ordering them smashed in spite. At that very moment, Togan advanced from Jalum, crossing the river to strike at Thăng Long. With most of Daiviet's army withdrawn, the capital fell quickly into his grasp. And yet, as before, what greeted him was no prize, no plunder, only another empty city, abandoned to the wind. Meanwhile, far to the north at Cho Tu Minh, a Yuan detachment still lingered, tasked with guarding the puppet rulers they sought to impose upon Daiviet. On February 1st, 1288, the enemy marched upon Noi Bang Pass, only to find themselves caught in a trap. The Trần forces struck from front and rear, cutting off every path of escape. Panic erupted in the Yuan ranks, and even their Viet collaborators scattered like frightened cattle. The warriors of Daiviet gave no quarter, chasing them down with relentless fury. By day's end, nearly 5,000 invaders lay dead upon the field. Only a ragged handful survived. A few dozen cavalry, along with the traitors who had thrown in their lot with the Mongols. They fled in disgrace, limping back across the border to Cho Tu Minh. And it was there, on that bitter retreat, that they stumbled in on the first day of the new year, the 3rd of February, in 1288, the year of the rat. Meanwhile, in the waters off Vendôme, Admiral Trần Canh Du bore the weight of his earlier defeat. Word of his failure reached the Trần court, and the king sent messengers demanding an explanation. Knowing well his fault, Trần Canh Du did not protest. Instead, he begged for a few days' grace, time enough to redeem himself, to turn disgrace into honor, and to strike back at the enemy with blood and fire. In the early days of February 1288, the Yuan commanders grew confident. With Omar Ni's fleet already pushing ahead to clear the way, General Truong Van Ho brought his massive convoy of supply ships slowly into Hạ Long Bay. But fate was waiting for him at Vendôme. From the shadows of the sea, Admiral Trần Canh Du struck like a thunderbolt. His forces stormed upon the Yuan fleet in a sudden, furious assault. The invaders reeled in shock. Their ships splintered, their soldiers thrown into the water. Countless men drowned beneath the crashing waves as chaos consumed the convoy. Desperate to escape, Truong Van Ho ordered the grain and supplies thrown overboard, lightening the ships just enough to break free. By sheer luck, he managed to flee across the open sea, limping back to Quinchou, off the island of Hainan. For this victory, Trần was spared punishment, his earlier failure now erased by triumph. The Trần court even released captured Yuan soldiers, sending them back with grim news for Prince Tat Huan. But Tat Huan refused to believe it. He dismissed the report as nothing more than a cunning ruse of the Trần king, and so he sent Ma Ni to await the arrival of Trung Văn Ho's supply fleet, never realizing that it was already lost to the depths. On the 10th of February, 1288, the fleet of Ma Ni sailed into the Dai Bang estuary, only to find the navy of Daiviet waiting, led by none other than Trần Hưng Đạo himself. The Vietnamese struck first, fierce and unrelenting, cutting down swathes of the enemy. But when it became clear that the Yuan still held strong, Trun's forces pulled back, slipping away into the rivers. Ma Ni pressed onward, steering his fleet toward the estuary of An Bang, where he lingered, waiting for the supply ships of Trung Văn Ho, ships that had already been shattered at Vân Đồn. Meanwhile, Prince Tat Huan, having occupied Thăng Long, found himself in a living nightmare. Day and night, Daiviet's people harassed his troops, ambushes striking from every shadow. Supplies dwindled, hunger gnawed at the men, and the grain fleet never came. At last, Tat Huan had no choice but to march his weary army back to the great base at Vạn Kiếp. Ma Ni, still stranded at An Bang, waited nearly a month before finally steering his ships through the Bạch Đằng River, retreating to Vạn Kiếp as well. By then, Trần Hưng Đạo had gathered his strength at Thap Sun, and King Trần himself had marched north from Thanh Hoa to reinforce him at Trúc Đông. The stage was set. But Tat Huan was not ready to yield. He dispatched General Bat Sik to strike Trúc Đông and reclaim the initiative. Yet, as the Yuan troops advanced, they found themselves lost in a labyrinth of rivers and streams, a watery maze where every bend concealed danger. The Daiviet forces fought like the very spirit of the land itself, hurling the enemy back again and again. Unable to break through, Bat Sik was forced to retreat, his men battered, his hopes in tatters. By the end of March 1288, the Yuan forces by both land and water had gradually been confined to Vạn Kiếp and its surrounding occupied areas, their territory steadily shrinking under the attacks of the Daiviet army. An epidemic also began to spread through their camps as the weather shifted from spring to summer. Seeing the situation turning unfavorable, Tat Huan had no choice but to order a retreat back to Yuan territory by both land and river routes before matters spiraled out of control. On March 30th, 1288, the Great Retreat began. Admiral Ma Ni and Phan Thiếp led the Yuan Navy downriver, desperate to escape. On land, Trịnh Bang Phi and Dat Chut marched alongside, meant to shield their withdrawal. But at Dong Trieu Market, disaster struck. The bridges had been destroyed. The land army had no choice but to turn back to Vạn Kiếp. Meanwhile, Ma Ni pressed on eastward, steering his fleet toward the Bạch Đằng River, hoping its waters would carry him safely to the sea. But the Trần dynasty already knew his path. Grand Commander Trần Hưng Đạo and his generals had prepared a final reckoning. Along the retreat, Emperor Trần Nhân Tông himself ordered constant strikes, harassing the enemy from Vạn Kiếp all the way down to the river. And then there, on the Bạch Đằng, where the tides rose and fell with punishing force, Trần Hưng Đạo laid his trap. Beneath the water, hidden from sight, his men drove sharp wooden stakes deep into the riverbed, cloaking them with weeds and grass. A deadly forest waiting to tear the enemy apart. On April 8th, 1288, Admiral Ma Ni's fleet reached the junction where the Da Bach River met the Ja River. His lieutenant, Lu Kuei, was sent ahead along the Ja to scout the way. But the Daiviet were ready. Trần forces had already stationed a powerful force there, blocking the passage and forcing the Mongols back into the path that had been carefully laid out for them. And so, with no other choice, the Yuan fleet pressed on, sailing straight down the Da Bach River, exactly where Trần Hưng Đạo wanted them to be. At dawn, on April 9th, 1288, the Mongol fleet advanced toward Trang Kinh Mountain, right as the tide was at its highest. Trần Hưng Đạo ordered his men to strike swiftly, then feign retreat. Ma Ni took the bait. Believing victory was within his grasp, he unleashed his entire fleet in hot pursuit. But just as the Yuan ships pressed deeper into the river, the tide began to fall. fast. One by one, their heavy warships slammed into the hidden stakes driven deep beneath the waters. Hulls shattered, decks splintered, men were thrown into chaos. That was the signal. From both banks of the river, Daiviet forces erupted. Trun warships surged from the Uong River, while infantry stormed down from Trang Khen, slamming shut the trap behind the Mongol fleet. In moments, the Bạch Đằng became a sea of fire. Panicked, Von Tip tried to land troops on Trang Khen slopes, only to be cut down by waiting ambushes. The falling tide revealed rows of sharpened stakes, ripping through Mongol vessels. The river clogged with wreckage and drowning men, neither advance nor retreat possible. For hours, the slaughter raged. The Yuan collapsed under relentless blows, their discipline shattered, their courage gone. At the climax, Trần Hưng Đạo himself, alongside both Trần kings, led the mightiest warships into battle. The Daiviet warriors roared with fire in their veins, while Mongol morale crumbled into despair. The trap was complete. The river ran red. Omanyi was captured alive. The elite navy of the Mongol Empire, some 60,000 men, was annihilated. 400 ships seized, 200 sunk. The Daiviet too paid a price, losing around 5,000 men and several warships, but the victory was absolute. The Battle of Bạch Đằng became legend. The day the most feared navy of the Yuan dynasty was broken, shattered upon the stakes of Daiviet's cunning and resolve. On the 8th of April, 1288, Prince Togon split his battered forces in two, retreating through the mountains in a desperate bid to escape. To the east, Abaki led the vanguard, with Togon himself trailing close behind. To the west, General Tichdoni marched his men through the rugged pass of Chilang, heading toward Langson, only to be harried again and again by relentless Daiviet forces. Cut off, bloodied, and beaten back at every turn, Tichdoni had no choice but to abandon his path and turn toward Togon, hoping to regroup and survive. On April 11th, 1288, the retreating Yuan army marched into Noibang, only to be ambushed yet again. They fought desperately to break free, and at last, Prince Togon managed to link up with General Tichdoni. But their relief was short-lived. Word came that ahead lay 300,000 Daiviet troops hidden in ambush. Panic spread like wildfire through the camp. In truth, it was a ruse. Most of the Daiviet main forces had already moved toward the coast. Yet fear ruled the Mongol prince's heart. Togon ordered his men onto narrow, treacherous paths to escape. Along the way, his loyal generals and guards threw themselves into harm's way, shielding him with their very bodies. Only then did Togon make it back across the border, broken and humiliated, to the land he once thought he would conquer. And so, the third Mongol invasion of Daiviet came to a close. Prince Togon, humiliated, was cast out from the Yuan court. General Omar, captured in battle, was released by the Trun, only to drown at sea when his ship went down. Though Daiviet stood victorious, the scars ran deep. Countless lives were lost, fields lay in ruin, and the shadow of war lingered. Seeking peace and survival, the Trun court once more sent tribute, hoping to quench the flames of conflict and stave off the Mongol sword. But history remembers what mattered most. 3 times, the armies of Daiviet stood against the mightiest empire on earth, and 3 times, they triumphed. Through courage, wit, and unyielding resolve, a small nation preserved its independence and its land. The victories at Dongbo Do, at Chengdeung, and most gloriously at Bạch Đằng stand forever as crimson marks in the scrolls of history, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the Vietnamese people against foreign conquest. And so, the third Mongol invasion ended in flames and ruin. Kublai's grand fleet sank beneath the waters. His armies scattered across the jungles and mountains of Daiviet. Never again would the Mongols return to this land. 3 times they came, and 3 times they were broken. But history is never truly finished. For the spirit of Dong-A would echo for centuries, a reminder that even the mightiest empire can be humbled by the unity of a people who refuse to bow. I'm Mr. Wolf, and this has been Timeless Tales. Until next time, stay hungry for history.